Last year, Dragon's Dogma turned 10, which by my reckoning makes it something that you can acceptably feel nostalgic for. The strange thing is that it had already got me feeling that way during my first time through in 2012. Back then I wasn't nostalgic for the game itself, of course. Its world just had something about it that my brain recognised as feeling familiar to the many fantasy worlds of my childhood. I was never really able to put my finger on why exactly until the 10th anniversary stream, during which some of the development team looked back at the game and its design philosophy. Turns out there's some clever ways they managed to make a world that taps into a sense of nostalgia, and I reckon it can have that effect on almost anyone. It starts with something Daigo Ikano, the game's art director, mentioned when describing his design approach. He goes, "I thought of the kind of fantasy I knew since I was a kid, very traditional high fantasy." You can see this influence instantly, and bringing this up shouldn't really surprise anyone. The story is about going on an adventure to slay a dragon, complete with magic, monsters and princesses. It's the kind of thing you'd say if a child asked for an impromptu bedtime story and you just reach for the first basic idea floating around in your sleep-deprived mind. Part of the game's nostalgia, of course, comes from when we were on the other end listening to those bedtime stories and enjoying simple stuff like them. What's special about Dragon's Dogma is how far it leans into these ideas, and I see this especially in creature design. Firstly, there's the selection itself. All are classics from either contemporary fantasy or mythology. You've got dragons, of course, along with cyclopes, hydras, harpies and more. There's even one of D&D's most iconic monsters, the Beholder, represented in the evil eye. Most people will have already encountered these monsters in other mediums. Just by the names alone, you could probably have guessed what they look like. Creating a fantasy world from scratch is a lot of work, and then filling it with interesting creatures that live there is even more. So creators often reach for some stock fictional beasties to ease the burden a bit. An audience won't care if your world has dragons, orcs, elves or dwarves, but they will want this new world to feel unique, because that's what'll make it interesting. Creators then come up with some twist on the basic formula, and the real nostalgic magic of Dragon's Dogma is in how it tackles that idea. Take the Chimera for example. Coming from Greek mythology, it's a fire-breathing hybrid made up of a lion, a goat, and a snake. In classical art and sculptures, it's usually just a normal lion with a goat's head attached to its back, and a snake in place of its regular tail. Plenty of fantasy worlds have used this basic stock creature, amongst them the God of War franchise. In the third installment, released 2 years before Dragon's Dogma, the Chimera has all the basic traits we'd expect, but some extra flair too. The lion's head is under the main body. It's got these 3 elongated horns, and it can even stand on 2 legs. Another example is the film Wrath of the Titans, released the same year as Dragon's Dogma. Its Chimera breathes fire, has a snake for a tail, and a body that roughly resembles the basic plan of a lion, but its 2 faces don't really look anything like a lion or a goat, and it has a big set of dragon wings too. Compare these two to the Chimera of Dragon's Dogma. Things like facial structure and muscles are more exaggerated than the real animals that served as inspiration, but otherwise it's almost exactly how the creature is traditionally depicted in Greek mythology. Which of the 3 you prefer is a matter of taste, and I'm not trying to argue that the Dragon's Dogma design is objectively the best, although it is my favourite of the bunch. It's to illustrate that this "our monsters have to be different" pressure doesn't seem to have bothered the game's designers at all. This classic style is seen across all the game's creatures. Cyclopes look exactly how you'd expect them to look, along with griffins and hydras and skeleton warriors. Again, from the 10th anniversary stream, Daigo Ikano revealed that this was completely intentional when he said, "There are still old sculptures from the past and other truly orthodox objects that indicate how these monsters were. So we combined these elements, refraining from eccentricities as much as we could, and stuck to the basics to create this visual world." Avoiding the word it took me countless takes to get right, and keeping things basic creates a link to the truly ancient depictions, but also to the more contemporary classics. Back when these monsters were depicted on screen for the first time, people also looked back to the old orthodox descriptions for inspiration. As the pioneers of the scene, designers had to contend with the limits of what the nascent special effects industry could do, but they also likely didn't feel as much pressure to add unique twists on the classical descriptions. After all, this would be the first time anyone in the world saw stuff like this. The result was designs that we might call simple compared to what the modern CGI-enhanced industry can produce. Although that's not to say that they're bad or that modern designs are better. There's this tasteful restraint to many of them, and they've often given a fantastic base that countless others have built upon over time. By taking the same approach to design as these classics once did, Dragon's Dogma manages to create a familiarity between itself and these older works, many of which you might have been exposed to when you were younger, or at least make you think back to older times. Personally, most of the monsters remind me of classic fantasy adventure films I watched as a kid, like The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and Jason and the Argonauts. But equally important as the monsters is the world they've been placed in. The game has some interesting landmarks, ruins and dungeons, but everything remains pretty grounded in a sense of realism. Other designers bend the rules of reality to create impossible locations. Grancis looks a bit simple if you start comparing. The world was informed by location scouting in the UK. For example, the fields in the game were inspired by the Welsh countryside, using castles and staircases as reference. One last time from the 10th anniversary stream, Daigo Ikano says that there were many steep hills going up and down, which was great for reference. For example, the hills really define what you're able to see. Looking far away and still being able to see a target location was really what shaped the terrain for the game. It was the best fit for us. This has the rather obvious effect of making the game's world feel familiar to those who live or spent time in the UK and Europe. But more interestingly, I think it helps foster those same impressions of nostalgia and familiarity in those who've grown up in other parts of the world. Regardless of whether you've been to the places that inspired the game, the approach created a world that feels tangible and believable because it's pretty much just an exaggerated version of reality. And that's exactly what every child all over the world experiences when they're playing around outside. I'm sure that countless of us once imagined that we were knights going on an adventure, where play transforms a stick into a sword and a quiet forest into one filled with monsters and magic. The laws of reality mandate that kids have to play in the normal world, and so their imagination enhances that mundane arena and makes it more fun. It's still the normal world we know, but it feels more magical. Because the game's world feels so familiar to our own, either because you've been to places like it or recognised that you could, it manages to capture this same impression of a childhood fantasy land. Fill it with designs and ideas that harken back to older times, and you end up with a game that has this nostalgic pull, even if you've never played it before. But despite being so seemingly rooted in what's come before it, the result is an experience that feels wholly unique. And that's partly because the game, of course, does have its own twists and new ideas, especially towards the late game, but also because there's not really another modern IP that unifies these ideas so well in its presentation. It's not just nostalgia bait or reference for the sake of reference, but a way for the game to strengthen its identity and help craft the experience it wants to give players. If you haven't played it before, go do it. I know I haven't talked about the gameplay at all here, but if you like Monster Hunter or action games in general, then you'll probably enjoy it. It's something that feels familiar and yet completely unique, something you don't see often because they seem like contradictory impressions. It is a bit weird to see them together, but it makes for a great time. Thanks for watching.